If you hit on your running backs, you're more than halfway to winning your league. Today, we're going to talk about early round studs, mid-round values, and late round handcuffs that can win you your league on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today, we're talking running backs, and you'll notice I'm in a slightly different situation. My normal setup has been drowned by my dishwasher, and so you're getting a little bit of a very fancy background going on here. If you've got any questions about today's show, make sure you leave them in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with Noah. I will answer all of your questions over there. If you want to check out my quarterback rankings, they're already up on YouTube. Plus, you can check out my full rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Let's get into it for today. And we start at the top with Saquon Barkley, who is my clear number one running back this year. And I think arguably could be taken first overall depending on your league setting. It's definitely him or Ja'Marr Chase, and everyone else is miles behind. Barkley was the definitive number one running back last season. He had over 2,000 rushing yards, and while he wasn't overly used in the receiving game because of how Jalen Hurts plays, he got plenty of rushing touchdowns. It has been since 2017-18 that we saw a running back get back to the number one spot again. That was Todd Gurley. It is entirely possible that someone else takes this number one spot. In fact, I think it's more likely to be someone else than it is to be Barkley. Having said that, there is nobody else who individually is more likely to be the number one running back in fantasy this year than Barkley. That workload will definitely return. The O-line is still very strong. The Eagles are going to be winning a whole heap of games, and you need to make sure you don't lose your league with your first pick, and Barkley optimizes your chances of doing that. So with the number one pick in your drafts, you've got to be choosing between Ja'Marr Chase and Saquon Barkley. And if you've got the number two pick, that's even better because you just get whichever one is left over. Number two for me is a bit of a surprise for a lot of people. I really like Christian McCaffrey here. For me, even in the first round of your draft, you should still be trying to win your league. And I think that McCaffrey gives you a better chance of winning your league than any other player available. He has had some struggles in recent years. We saw that happen in 2020 and 2021, and he bounced back in 2022 and 2023 with a pair of top two fantasy seasons. I see no reason that can't happen again. I know he's getting very close to 30, and that is a real falling off point for running backs. But because of how McCaffrey runs, because he does so much of his work out of the backfield, I feel like there's a lot of upside here for him to still remain a top fantasy asset and have his workload a little bit hidden by how much receiving work he does. Also worth noting that the 49ers are now without Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk's obviously coming back from injury, so they are going to need McCaffrey's receiving work even more. They've come out and blatantly said McCaffrey will get all the carries he can handle, and we've seen that happen in the past. The 49ers will use their top running back over and over and over again. His workload is so well insulated that you can feel good about him on a weekly basis, and that is the kind of league winning performance that I'm looking for my first round pick. So even though he's going to be available probably around pick 7 or 8, I'd be taking him as early as pick 3 depending on my league settings. Bijan Robinson's in at number 3, and I expect the Falcons to take a big step forward this year. Michael Penix gets his first full year as the starter. They have finally improved the defense, and that's really going to improve Robinson's opportunities to get involved in the run game. He had over 300 carries last season, and his efficiency remained pretty high, going at 4.8 yards an attempt. I see no reason to think that he can't go over 2,000 yards from scrimmage, should still get double-digit touchdowns, and will be a top 5 fantasy finisher if he stays healthy all season. The question is, what does that look like compared to the other running backs in this range? I feel like he's far more secure than someone like a Jahmyr Gibbs, who's obviously got the changes to the O-line, and more secure than Derrick Henry, given his receiving workload. But I don't think he has the upside of a Saquon Barkley, given the offense of the Eagles. And he doesn't have the upside of Christian McCaffrey, given how McCaffrey is used. We will still see Tyler Algier used a fair bit here for the Falcons, especially in blowouts. And I also don't think the Falcons are as likely to have as many games where Robinson just runs the whole game out. They still have a good passing offense, and I expect them to use that a reasonable amount. So for that reason, Robinson slides in at 3 for me. That means I'm not going to get him in a lot of leagues. In most situations where Robinson's available, I'm probably going to take McCaffrey. Having said that, if Barkley and McCaffrey are off the board, I would happily take Bijan as early as the 4th pick, depending on what the league settings are. If it's a 3 wide receiver league, obviously I'm going to prefer someone like a Justin Jefferson. But if Chase and Jefferson are both off the board, then I think a Robinson is an entirely reasonable pick within the top 5 overall in the first round of your draft. 30-year-old running backs aren't meant to be as good as Derrick Henry was last year, and yet he finished as the running back 2 in half PPR. For that reason, I do think he is likely to have another very good season, assuming he can stay healthy and drop-off doesn't occur. We didn't see any signs of drop-off last season, and he has stayed healthy for the vast majority of his career, really only missing games in 2021. His efficiency increased from a little over 4 yards a carry to nearly 6 yards a carry last year, as the Ravens were excellent in the run game and Henry really showed out in that offense. They remain very run-heavy. Lamar Jackson opens a lot of lanes for him, and while the passing game isn't really that helpful for him, and in PPR, I would consider taking him after Gibbs and Genty. In half PPR, for me, he is the clear running back 4. Where do you take him, though, compared to other positions? I would probably be taking him after CeeDee Lamb and potentially even after guys like Puka Nacua and Malik Neighbors. I do think there is some risk here, but it depends on how you want to structure your team. In a non-PPR league, on the other hand, I think it's easy to argue that he could even be a top 5 pick. He is that good on the ground. Jahmyr Gibbs is number 5 for me for now. I'm still struggling with this one. I need to look a little bit more into the Lions O-line. They have me very, very, very scared. They've made some negative changes there. They've lost Ben Johnson. We're still going to have David Montgomery around. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about Jahmyr Gibbs. And yet, he was the running back 3 last season, despite only carrying the ball 250 times. He did admittedly have 500 yards through the air, and I expect that probably continues. In fact, it probably even improves with the O-line downgrade. The question is, does the offense change, and what does that look like? Is he going to lose some of the 20 touchdowns he had last season? Because that made a massive difference. Entering his 3rd year in the league, I think we now know what to expect from Gibbs. We know how excellent he is when they get the ball into his hands, but they can't overuse him and they won't overuse him. And that does cap his ceiling a little bit, as opposed to Ashton Genty, who could arguably get as much of the ball as he can handle. For that reason, it's a real question mark of how you value the upside of a Genty and the security of someone like Gibbs. And keep in mind that Gibbs still has a lot of upside if you get a severe injury to David Montgomery. If Montgomery goes down, you're not going to suddenly see Craig Reynolds come in and get a dozen carries every single game and snipe him at the goal line. That is going to be Gibbs's backfield, and that is going to be huge for fantasy. So there's also that handcuff upside with Gibbs as well that you do also have to consider. That brought in with the fact that there is a lot of security in his role is why I currently have him above Genty, but I could imagine me moving the Raiders guy ahead very soon. And speaking of Ashton Genty, well, if you saw my recent piece on running backs and what to expect from rookie running backs over their careers, you'll know that any running backs drafted within the top 20 picks are highly likely to end up as a top 5 running back at some stage in their career. In fact, everyone drafted in that range since 2013 has ended up as a top 5 running back at some stage in their career. And most of the time, it happened immediately, especially when they went straight into a starting role. I will be doing another analysis talking about what to expect in the first year for these rookie running backs later on in the offseason. So definitely look out for that one. But I expect that it's going to give me even more encouragement around Genty and what to expect this year. We know that he's going into the clear number 1 role. We know they need to lean on him because Geno Smith cannot be the focal point of this offense. We know that the O-line is pretty solid and the run game for the Raiders has been good for a long time. And we know that in general, Pete Carroll wants to get the run game going. He always has, and it's particularly important for him to get it going for him this year. You see, Brennan Carroll, Pete's son, is the run game coordinator for the Raiders. And with Pete obviously out of the league quite soon, I think he wants to hand over the reins to his kids. And for that reason, he really wants to give his son every opportunity to succeed. So I expect we will see a lot of Ashton Genty this year. If he has a massive career year, that's going to look very good for the run game coordinator. Now, in behind Genty, I do have a little bit of a gap. While I'll be considering taking Genty in the first round of drafts, in fact, I'd be considering taking him ahead of Gibbs and potentially even Henry in a PPR league, as I said earlier, and hence as high as maybe 7th or 8th pick. I would not be considering Jonathan Taylor. He's very much an early second round pick for me. Behind those 6 wide running backs, I'd also be taking a heap of wide receivers as well, because I feel like Taylor doesn't have quite as much security. Having said that, he's still the clear next running back off the board for me. The biggest concern with Taylor, he hasn't had as many as 20 receptions in either of his last 2 seasons, and that's not going to change with an Anthony Richardson or a Daniel Jones, who both love to scramble and don't check down a lot. So while I would still expect that Taylor gets well over 300 carries and can turn that into, 1,700 yards, assuming he remains averaging over 4.5 yards a carry, which he's always done throughout his career, that should be enough to at least make Taylor a top 10 and possibly even a top 5 running back this season. It's just that lack of receiving work that really caps his upside. So it makes him very safe, but it's hard to see him getting into that top 5, and I can't see him getting past any of those top 6 guys. So for fantasy, that means he's a fantastic second round pickup because you know what you're going to get from him. He offers you a heap of security. You just got to hope that he can stay healthy, which has been a struggle as he hasn't played over 14 games in any of the last 3 seasons. My number 8 being Josh Jacobs might surprise some people. We're talking about a guy who was top 5 in fantasy last season. He had 16 touchdowns. The role hasn't changed. They haven't brought anyone else in. In fact, AJ Dillon's out. Marshall Lloyd is technically the number 2 guy. We didn't see a lot from him last season, but it is going to be Josh Jacobs' role. He had over 300 carries last season. He averaged about 4.5 yards a carry. That's always going to be good for a good 1,300, 1,400 yards. He gets enough receiving work out of the backfield to supplement that as well. And he gets a heap of touchdowns because Jordan Love can't really be trusted fully in the red zone. So for that reason, you should still expect another 15 odd touchdowns too. And that will be enough for a top 10 fantasy season. This is a very secure situation, especially in half PPR. Even in a PPR league, I can see an argument for someone like a Devon Achane, but for me, Josh Jacobs is so much safer, and I love taking him in this spot. There is nothing really to worry about here because you know that he is going to get so many touches, and touches are gold for running backs. But I do have Achane in at number 9. He was good last season without being fantastic. Obviously, he was explosive in his rookie season on limited touches. He doubled his amount of rushing attempts last season and got just 100 more rushing yards. That's kind of what happens when you take a small back and give them a whole heap of workload. All of a sudden, they're not able to break off those big runs. Plus, they're not very effective in short yardage situations, and that's very much the case with Achane. I expect to see plenty of Jalen Ryder, maybe even some Alexander Madison or Ollie Gordon in those short yardage situations, and that's going to affect Achane's touchdown scoring. That's going to affect Achane's amount of touches, but it might make him more efficient again. Last season, he had nearly 80 receptions. I don't think we're going to see that again with Darren Waller in. And I do think they're going to recognize they need to get Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle going, or this offense just isn't going to work. So I think we see a drop back in the number of receptions, which is going to hurt Achane, particularly in PPR. Having said that, he is still a very solid, safe option. We know how explosive he can be. We know that they don't really have many other elements to their offense, and they're still trying to make this work and win this year. So for that reason, I do think that assuming Tua Tagovailoa can stay healthy, Achane can have another good top 10 fantasy season. I do think his upside, though, is massively capped because he's never going to get 300 carries. I'm not even sure he's going to get the 200 he got last season this season. I think that could drop significantly, but we still see a heap of receiving work, and he's essentially a wide receiver that also gets some carries because He just is not being effective enough where being used between the tackles. Yes, Chase Brown had a solid season last season, but remember, he wasn't even the starter at the start of the season. That didn't happen until week 5, and he really didn't take over properly until Zach Moss's injury in week 8. From week 9 onwards, he was the running back 6 on the season. Having said that, Zach Moss is back. And I don't think that Moss is going to suddenly become the starter, but Moss is going to take some touches away that wasn't happening last year. Plus, Samaje Perine will come in and will take a lot of the receiving work. And Chase did get over 50 receptions last year. The issue with Chase Brown is that he's not the greatest blocker out of the backfield. He's okay, but he's nowhere near Perine's levels. And I think on a lot of third downs and on all 2-minute drills, we are going to see a lot of Samaje Perine. And that gives me a lot of room to pause and think about Chase Brown. I'm unsure whether to focus on the upside we saw from the second half of last season, where he was excellent on the ground, or if we recognize that he's going to get limited receiving work and probably get less touches because of Moss's return. For that reason, he slides in at 10 for me. I can't put him any higher because I think the other guys have more secure roles, and I'm tempted to move him down to number 11 because my number 11 is Bucky Irving, whose role also grew last season as he took over from Rashad White. White is still there, and likewise, White will do a lot of the receiving work. But Irving last season, even with White there, still managed to get nearly 50 receptions and nearly 400 receiving yards. He also only had a little bit over 200 carries, and I think that rises a heap this season. For that reason, I think Irving has a real chance of being a top 10 running back, but I think the upside to do more than that is really based on whether White can stay healthy and keep his role. White's going to be getting a lot less carries because he was very inefficient on the ground, but he was a very good receiving back. And we saw when White was at college that he was very good on limited touches. So that's what they'll be trying to do with him. That means that Irving can do most of the heavy lifting. That's not as efficient generally, but because of the heavy passing game of the Buccaneers, it does open up a lot of space for their run game. And I do think Irving could have a very good season this year. How good a season? Well, I probably wouldn't be taking him anywhere above 10. However, it really does depend on your league settings and how much you value running backs. I think you could argue taking him in the second round, midway through the second round, is a solid choice, but I probably won't be touching him unless he falls a little bit into the third round, depending on the league settings. My number 12 running back is Kareem Williams, and he finally had a healthy season last season, and he didn't look great. 4 yards a carry is nothing special, a drop of nearly a yard a carry from his breakout season in 2023. Still doesn't get a lot of receiving work, but boy, does he score a lot of touchdowns. 31 combined touchdowns across the last 2 seasons. That's more than one a game. He also had well over 300 carries. Will that change this year? Well, we know that the Rams have been trying to get another running back involved. They drafted Blake Corum last season and then barely used him. They drafted Jaquez Hunter this year. Will he suddenly come in and be the number 2 or even threaten the number 1 role? We know that Williams himself was, of course, a day 3 running back. So it's hard to know what the Rams are doing with their running back situation. I feel like Williams' role is very safe for now. But of all these guys we've talked about so far, he's really the only one in the top 18 or so of my rankings that has any risk of losing his role, because I do think their insistence on trying to bring other running backs in does suggest they're not fully happy with Williams, and rightly so, because he hasn't been overly efficient. Having said that, the Rams have made minor improvements to their O-line. I do think the passing game in general is going to be a lot better, and that should open up a lot of holes for Williams. Hopefully also having some healthy tight ends who can come in and actually do something is going to help Williams out as well. His ceiling for me is probably just the edge of the top 10 based on volume, but he is ultimately pretty safe volume-wise. He has been a top 6 running back each of the last 2 seasons. And while I think that it's unlikely that happens again without injuries to other running backs, I do think the amount of touchdowns he's going to score is going to keep adding value, assuming that that doesn't change. Now, this probably isn't the James C. you're expecting to see in this space, but James Conner is just someone that is underrated every single season. Injuries has killed him over the years, but he's remained one of the better running backs in the league, despite the terrible blocking from the Cardinals on a consistent basis. He is so good when they get him out in space, which is why he's so useful in the receiving game. Finally stayed relatively healthy last season, had over 4.5 yards a carry, still doesn't get enough touchdown love, except in 2021 where he had those 18 touchdowns. He has generally been very disappointing around the goal line, but I can imagine that stepping up if the Cardinals can get things going a little bit better this season. Trey Benson remains a little bit of a concern, and Connor is 30 now, but we have no reason to believe that he has taken a step back, as the last 2 seasons have been the best we've seen from him on the ground. He has just been so darn consistent. So for that reason, I believe that James Conner is once again going to be on the cusp of the top 10. His role is secure. They gave him the big contract. Benson hasn't done anything to suggest that we're going to see any change in his role. And the good news with Conner is you don't need to take him here. Most of these guys that I'm talking about right now are going to go in the 3rd round of your drafts, maybe early 4th round. You can take Conner in the 5th round. He's probably still going to be there. Certainly late 4th round is entirely viable. So for that reason, just keep in mind that he's here. Take somebody else and then come back and get him in the 4th round. But no, the value is huge because James Conner is one of the best running backs in the league. It's just that he's on a rubbish offense and they don't do a very good job of blocking for him, but he will make things happen every time. Just watch him play and you can see just how good he is. Meanwhile, James Cook seems to think he's James Conner, but he's not. He gets all the benefits of being on an excellent offense with their strong blocking, with the fact that Josh Allen's skills always open up a heap of space for the running back, and he still average under 5 yards a carry. He doesn't get a heap of volume, firstly because they're doing a whole heap of other stuff, because Allen takes the ball so often and is such a big part of their game. And in general, they just don't like to use the running backs as much, but they still use them very effectively. He ended up getting over 1,000 yards despite just 207 carries. Gets a little bit of work in the passing game, but with Ty Johnson emerging and getting more involved last season, that really actually hurt him last year. Ended up with only 32 receptions, only 250 receiving yards. That's not very efficient. That's under 10 yards a reception, which is pretty poor for a running back in this offense. The thing that really helped him last season is that his touchdown total tripled despite getting less carries. I think we're going to see some regression there, and that's why I'm not willing to rank Cook quite as high. In fact, I'm considering dropping him down because there's so much talk about him holding out for more money. It's ridiculous that he wants a new contract given he hasn't been that great and he's still going into his 4th year. Plus, they've got Ray Davis, who we saw could do exactly what James Cook could do anyway. So this is a bit of a weird situation. Cook scares me a little bit for fantasy for that reason, but he is ultimately still their number 1 guy on a very good offense, and that makes him pretty darn reliable. I just wouldn't be expecting another 18 touchdowns this season. Breece Hall comes in at 15, and I'm expecting a bounce back from him this season. He barely had over 200 carries in a given season, never had over 1,000 rushing yards, but has at times looked pretty darn efficient. It's always been the receiving work where he has been a boss. He's had 133 receptions over the last 2 seasons combined for over 1,000 receiving yards. And you think that it'd happen again, and yet it definitely won't because Justin Fields is the quarterback. That's going to really open a heap of rushing lanes for Hall, but it's going to badly hurt his receiving work. And while they still lack legitimate receiving options, Fields doesn't need to pass the ball at all. He's just going to run himself as well. And that means check downs are going to be few and far between. That is going to hurt Hall. Having said that, with Tyler Conklin out, it is possible that the role of the check down guy only goes to Hall this time because Mason Taylor is a little bit more of a blocking tight end as their starter. The other risk with Breece Hall as well is that I think we see a lot more of the backups. We saw them bring in both Allen and Davis last season, and they looked pretty solid. So I think we could see a situation where this turns into a little bit of a 3-headed committee, and that makes me very nervous, and it has me considering dropping Hall further down. The only reason I don't is because the upside, if he's given the clear number 1 role and given the proper amount of touches, is huge. If he actually gets that proper role, he will be a top 10 running back, and we know he has the potential to be a top 5 running back. If he had been on pace on the pace he was in his rookie season and early in his second season, he would easily be a top 5 running back on a number of occasions. It just hasn't happened because of a number of issues. They also need to score more touchdowns for him. He hasn't gotten double-digit touchdowns yet. We saw the difference that made with James Cook last season. If they can do that with Breece Hall, then all of a sudden we're talking about the fantasy monster we expected when we drafted him in the first round relatively recently. So I'm not willing to take Hall early, but around that 4th round region, he does become a viable option because he does at least have a heap of upside, even if the floor is lower than a lot of the guys in this range. Alvin Kamara comes in at 16 for me, and I think in PPR, I'd actually have him a lot higher. I think in PPR, you could argue he belongs as high as 13 or maybe even 12. He does offer such good receiving work. He's had at least 47 receptions every season, but most seasons he's getting up towards 70 or 80. It really depends how many games he's played. He's never played a fully healthy season since his rookie season, and I don't necessarily see that changing because he ain't young. He's into his 30s now, obviously a lot younger than me, but certainly someone who is going to have that age drop-off hit as well. It's just that Kendre Miller hasn't shown an ability to stay healthy, and I don't buy Devin Neal is going to come in and take over this job. This is still going to be Alvin Kamara's role, and I think we're probably even going to see a little bit less Taysom Hill this year as well. Tyler Shock is obviously a rookie quarterback, and even if it's Spencer Rattler, the same applies. These guys are going to check down to their running back. We're going to see a heap of touches from Alvin Kamara. It's not like there's a lot else going on in this passing game with just Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and guys like that as his only composition for targets. He's definitely the top running back in this offense, and he's arguably the top receiver. So you will see a lot of Alvin Kamara. As a general rule, the rule says don't draft players from bad offenses, but when they're getting this much volume around the 4th round, it is ultimately excellent value. And in PPR, I would argue that taking him in the 3rd round is entirely viable as well. I can't say I'm particularly excited about Chuba Hubbard. The team is insistent on drafting other running backs, even though Hubbard looked very good last season, getting nearly 5 yards a carry. I do think the offense in general maybe takes a step forward, but the problem is there's a lot more talent going around in the receiving room. While Bryce Young has looked a little bit better, he now has Ted McMillan to throw the ball to. I do think this offense in general with the passing game is going to be improved, and that probably hurts Hubbard's output. He did admittedly only have 250 carries last season, which isn't exactly a massive amount, and I can see him getting that again. It's really his receiving work that I think takes a step back because he was extremely inefficient with his receiving work last year. He was getting less than 5 yards per reception, which is awful for a running back. He was getting less yards per reception than he was getting per carry. It was diabolically bad. In fact, last season, he had 171 receiving yards on 43 receptions. Keep in mind that 2 years ago, he had 171 receiving yards on 14 receptions. So he tripled the amount of receptions and got the same amount of receiving yards. That's really bad. So they're going to need to find ways of sorting that out. It might be that he gets less receiving work or they bring some of the other guys in. Obviously, they brought Trevor Etienne in. They could use him. Rico Dowdle maybe gets a little bit more of the receiving work. These other names are going to have an impact on Hubbard, and that hurts his output. That's why I've got him well below the top 16. He at least got double-digit touchdowns last season, and the improved Panthers offense might help, but gosh, I'm nervous about Hubbard. Aaron Jones slides in at 18 for me. And that might be a bit of a surprise for some people, but he once again had a 1,000-yard season last season, had over 250 carries, had 50 receptions. It was really the lack of touchdowns that hurt him. And I think that number might go up a little bit when you've got JJ McCarthy, who you can't fully trust in the red zone as much as you could with Sam Darnold. I also think the Vikings are going to be excellent this year and in general are going to score a lot of points. For that reason, I really like Jones as an upside play. You can get him a lot later than this as well. He is not going as a top 20 running back. I don't know why, because there's not exactly any reason to believe that Jordan Mason's going to come in and take over. Jordan Mason wasn't anything special for the 49ers. He was like their 3rd running back off the board. He just comes in as the new backup because he's simply better than Ty Chandler. That's really the only reason that Jordan Mason is there. Aaron Jones is the number one guy here. He has had over 4.5 yards a carry in every season of his career, and there's no reason to think that won't happen again in season 9. The only risk is age drop-off, but we definitely didn't see it last season, as we saw him have his biggest ever rushing season and his second biggest receiving season. In fact, his biggest season overall from a yardage perspective. It was really only the touchdowns that stopped him from being a top 10 running back, and I see no reason they can't change this year. Now, I was very high on Joe Mixon going into this season, and even when I first ranked him, I think I had him 15 overall, and then they went and got Nick Chubb. Now, I don't think Nick Chubb is going to take over the lead role here, but it is going to affect Mixon's volume. He had 250-odd carries each of the last 2 seasons, despite missing 3 games last season. This season, on the other hand, I expect that to drop closer to about 200. And that's going to really hurt because he has averaged 4 yards a season basically over the course of his career. It's basically what you get out of him. It doesn't help that he hasn't been in the greatest rushing attacks, but it's basically what Joe Mixon is. He also got a lot of receiving work last season, and all of a sudden, we have a heap of excellent running backs and quality in the receiving room in Houston, and that is only going to hurt Joe Mixon. So while I still think double-digit touchdowns is likely, while I think that he's still the clear lead back, it is going to really affect his volume, and for that reason, I can't trust him to remain a top 15 running back. But I still think he's a solid, safe option. If he can somehow at least stay healthy, I do think that he will at least pay off on this cost. Kenneth Walker remains in an awful committee situation where he's playing less than half the snaps but still gets the lead touches. The weird thing is that Zach Charbonnet actually generally looked better last season when he had the opportunity. Walker just did not look healthy, only played 11 games, averaged less than 4 yards a carry. In fact, he's gotten worse on an efficiency perspective every season. His receiving work has improved. He at least had 46 receptions last year, nearly 300 yards, which is not very efficient, but at least it's solid. Yet to get to double-digit touchdowns either. Someone else will probably take Walker before it gets to the point where I'm at all interested. I think I'll probably have 0 shares. In fact, got to be honest, even tempted to move him down from this spot here. I just don't see the upside here. He's never been higher than a running back 19. He can't stay healthy. He's not looking very efficient. The offense in general could be pretty poor. I don't think Sam Darnold exactly has a history of checking down to his running backs. They have at least enough quality elsewhere that they don't need to rely on the run game as much as they did. And it's not Pete Carroll there anymore. So you do have to acknowledge that this might be a bad season for Walker. Definitely don't go out of your way to get him. DeAndre Swift at 21 is someone I'm really tempted to move up. And in a PPR, I think I probably would move him up because he is such a solid receiving back. I thought they were going to bring someone else in to threaten him. In fact, I do think Ashton Genty was someone they were very interested in. Having said that, there's not that much talent at running back on free agency. So it is going to be DeAndre Swift as the number 1 guy. Roschon Johnson will back him up, but he looked like nothing special. Travis Homer is going to do a relatively high amount of the receiving work. And then you've got a 7th round rookie in Monongai there as the only other backup. And I don't think that's an actual threat as much as people like drafting him in Dynasty. It is going to be DeAndre Swift's backfield. And this is going to be a lot easier for him this year because you don't have Caleb Williams being terrible. You have an actual O-line that's going to be able to create some blocking lanes to Swift. And we can expect a return to his normal efficiencies of over 4.5 yards a carry. He averaged 3.8 yards a carry last season. We can also expect a lot more work around the red zone because he only had 6 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. I think this is going to be a real bounce back season for DeAndre Swift, and I like his upside. I would argue you could easily take him ahead of Walker or Mixon. It is important to understand, though, there is way more risk with Swift than there are with other guys in this range. We know that he has had some issues with injuries in the past, although he stayed healthy all of last season. We know that he's never really shown an ability to have a heavy workload. But again, he had 250 carries and over 40 receptions last season. So I feel like that pushes back against a lot of those issues. But I acknowledge there is still a whole heap of risk here, and he could easily lose the role. He probably has a less secure role than most guys in this range, though for me, not less secure than a Kenneth Walker. Now we hit the other rookies, and Amarian Hampton is someone that I am mildly interested in. The problem is he's going to be taken before I get to him. People get really excited about rookie running backs, but it often takes them a long time to get going. I think you'll find that if you've got Amarian Hampton, you're very disappointed through about 6 weeks of the season. Naji Harris is going to get a whole heap of touches, and that is not going to change much unless Harris gets injured or Hampton just looks definitively better. I don't think we've actually seen the best of Naji Harris. The Steelers in general didn't use him very effectively after that first season. And I think we're going to find that in an actual offense with a good O-line and a team that knows how to use their run game, that Harris is going to be very effective for them, especially in those short yardage situations and on first downs. I do think we'll see Hampton get quite a bit of receiving work, which is certainly going to help him, especially for PPR. And I feel like he certainly has a heap of upside. If Harris goes down with injury, all of a sudden Hampton's someone we can talk about as a top 10 running back. So I can see the value in taking him there, but ideally in this range where we're talking about taking him in what, 5th, 6th round probably, all of a sudden, if you're taking that guy hoping for an injury, that's not really the range you want to be doing that in. That's more of like a 10th, 11th round sort of selection. So for that reason, Hampton has me a little bit nervous, but the talent is still definitively there. And I do think he could have a very good season if things go right for him. And we know that's happened with a heap of rookie running backs in the past. RJ Harvey is the next rookie running back for me off the board. The reason I'm not so sure on RJ Harvey is twofold. Firstly, J.K. Dobbins comes in, and that kind of ruins things a little bit for Harvey. When it looked like he was going to be the clear number one guy, the upside was huge. Now that he's the number two, or at least one of two, I don't know. I don't feel great about it. Look, certainly there's some upside there. They went out of their way to take him in the second round. That means something, but we're not talking about a very good back in Harvey. He's small. He's not a particularly good blocker. He's okay out of the backfield. I just don't see the upside. I don't really see how this is going to work. How is he going to pay off at this cost? I think he probably finishes up somewhere between 20 to 25. And this is where you're drafting him if you're drafting him as the number 23. But you kind of want to win your league. And to do that, you need some of your players paying out over their cost. And I just don't see that happening with Harvey. And for that reason, even though I'm ranking him at 23, I don't feel particularly good about it. It's just that there really aren't any other good running backs around. There's really like a massive drop-off after Swift. It's a top 21, and now we're into these guys who all have dings on them. Another guy who's got some serious dings on him is David Montgomery. The Lions' O-line looks worse this year. Jahmyr Gibbs has consistently looked better. Montgomery had a drop-off in efficiency, had a drop-off in touches. Really, the only thing he gained on last season was receiving work. He suddenly got a whole lot more receiving work again, which took him back towards seasons like 22 and before that. He has had 13 total touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons, and that has kept him as a top 20 running back. I can see reasons to expect that to regress again this year. For that reason, I'm not excited about David Montgomery. You shouldn't be either. The reason you would draft David Montgomery is if you're doing a 0 RB situation. If you decide to go heavy on wide receivers and maybe get a tight end and a quarterback, or within the first 5 or 6 rounds, then I would be considering Montgomery around the 6th round. Will he even be there in the 6th round? Well, it depends on your league settings. If it's a PPR league, then I think he's probably there in the 7th round, and all of a sudden you're talking about a viable option for your 0 RB situation that you can use and feel okay with until hopefully one of your late round running backs hits later on in the draft. Having said that, ideally, if it's me, I would rather wait a whole lot early before getting my first running back, because I think there are a heap of other guys who can do something very similar to Montgomery, do it way cheaper, do it slightly worse, and get you through to your backup running backs becoming starters. After Montgomery, we have Isaiah Pacheco, and there's way more upside here in Pacheco than there is with most players in this area. In fact, I think from an upside perspective, he's probably closer to the top 20 than anyone else except potentially Hampton, who I think needs an injury. Pacheco is someone who was the running back 13 in 2023, and then he got injured. That's really all that happened. The question is he healthy? If he is healthy, then all of a sudden we're not going to see a lot of Kareem Hunt because he's old and he's not looking particularly good. We're going to see hardly any of Elijah Mitchell because we haven't seen him for years. And again, he's old, not particularly good. Rashad Smith, he's ultimately a 7th round guy. And while my colleague Kiwi loves Rashad Smith, and I do have to respect that because the other guys he's loved in the last couple of years have been Tyrone Tracy, Puka Nacua, and this guy, Isaiah Pacheco, I don't believe that Smith is good enough to take over from Pacheco if Pacheco is healthy. If Pacheco is fully healthy and playing to his capacity, then he is going to pay off here. And Andy Reid did say in OTAs that Pacheco looks tremendous. So we've got to hope that he's healthy. And if he is, he will really pay off at this valuation because you're going to get him around the 6th round in that sort of dead spot where there's not a lot of other valuable players. And he could easily pay off as a top 15 or higher running back because we know the Chiefs are going to want to run the ball and rely on their defense. Got to be honest, I don't even know what to do with Tony Pollard. He's had over 1,000 yards in each of his last 3 seasons. He's managed to stay healthy. He's looked solid. He was on the cusp of being a top 20 running back last season, but there's just no upside here. They're not scoring points, the Titans. He had like 5 total touchdowns last season. He only had 6 the season before. In fact, he's only had 1 season with over 6 touchdowns in his career. That is basically what you get from Tony Pollard, and that's really ugly. I don't like that situation at all. So for that reason, I'm staying away from Tony Pollard. He is not someone that particularly interests me. Having said that, if you're doing that 0 RB strategy, you can get him around this 6th, 7th round area. That's not a true 0 RB, I understand. But if you're just going wide receiver heavy early, I'm okay with you taking Pollard. Kind of gives you something to work with until some of your younger guys or your handcuffs start to hit. Number 7 is Travon Henderson, and I do think he's going to be the starting running back. They brought in a guy who can block immediately. We know how valuable that is for the Patriots. They brought in a guy who is a clearly better runner than Ramondre Stevenson, who can't even hold onto the ball, and Antonio Gibson, who is more of ultimately a receiver. In fact, he was a receiver coming out of college. So for that reason, Henderson, to me, is a guy that you can feel okay about. The question is, even if you know he's the starter, how much do you want the Patriots running back? They're going to be bad this year. It's not like they're going to be moving the ball effectively and scoring a lot of touchdowns. I think his upside, even if he's the clear starting running back, is probably, a mid running back too. That's better than where you're getting him, but there's a sort of way lower floor where he's in an ugly committee with Antonio Gibson, and Ramondre Stevenson's still getting involved because they gave him a big contract. I don't like this situation at all. Henderson is someone I'm generally avoiding. Quinshon Judkins doesn't have the upside of being an every down back. I think he is going to be in some sort of a committee with Jerome Ford because that's how they've always used Ford. And I think that Dylan Sampson probably takes a lot of the third down work, but I think that Judkins could emerge over time to be a Nick Chubb-like guy. I think he certainly has that sort of talent and that sort of upside. That's why in Dynasty, I have him ranked ahead of Henderson. But I do think that he might struggle this year because I don't think the Browns are going to be good this year at all. I think it's going to take him a season or two before they really get going. But I do think that Judkins could still be solid, especially in half PPR. I don't think he's going to be getting a lot of receiving work. In PPR, I'd have him even lower than this. Another guy that definitely gets hurt by PPR is Caleb Johnson, another rookie who is going to be very much an early down banger for the Steelers. I think the Steelers could actually be pretty good this year. I think that bringing in Aaron Rodgers and then bringing in Jonnu Smith suggests to me that they really are trying to challenge, and I think they will challenge. I think they could easily be maybe the 5th best team in the conference, and that's going to make a big difference for them. Johnson is someone who is going to do a lot of the early down work, while Jalen Warren is kind of the lightning to his thunder, and will probably do reasonably high amount of the receiving work. The problem is, of course, you are also going to get Kenny Gainwell coming in and probably doing the third down work and the 2-minute drill. So this is going to be a committee situation. That hurts both of these guys, and it does limit Johnson's upside massively. But again, he's a fantastic option if you're in that 0 RB situation, but he's a bad guy if your plan is to use him as your running back 3 or your running back 4, and he's really subbing in for other guys because the upside's not there. If you want an upside guy, there are plenty of guys you can take in the later rounds and you can flesh out your other positions. For me, the only situation where you're really taking Johnson is if you need a starter because you're very strong at all the other positions. And I think Johnson could pay off if you approach him that way. Another guy that needs to be approached that way is Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson, no matter the situation, is going to be that early down guy. We saw it happen last year, and it's happened a heap of times in the past. He gets used quite a lot around the red zone, which is why he gets a reasonable amount of touchdowns. He's getting one every second game or so. In fact, even better than that over the last couple of seasons, around 60% of the time. Gets a little over 4 yards a carry because he does a lot of short yardage stuff, but that's actually pretty good given his role. Won't get over 200 or so rushes, won't get a lot of receiving work, but we'll get a little bit, depends how healthy Ekeler stays. But even if Eckler's out, I do think we probably still see Jeremy McNichols slide into that role. So Robinson will once again end up somewhere between 20 and 30. among the running backs, no matter how healthy he stays, unless he misses a whole heap of games. And for that reason, he's another very solid 0 RB option if he's there hanging around. Last season around this time, Tyrron Tracy was someone I was mentioning as someone that you want to take very late in drafts, especially if you're a little bit weak at running back, and it paid off pretty well this season. I think he is going to do very little. Unfortunately, the Giants, I don't think are going to have a clear number one running back. I think all three guys are going to be involved. I think Tracy's going to get the most touches, and we can expect 200 odd touches again. But he's not going to get used around the goal line much because that's going to be Cam Scatterboo's role. I expect him to be doing a lot of red zone work as the big back. And Devin Singletary is still there, and he will get some touches as a change of pace guy and maybe some work out of the backfield as well. I do think Tracy ultimately will get a fair amount of receiving work, though, and that's going to help him in PPR. And I do think he's going to get enough carries and hopefully have improved efficiency with this team being just a little bit better, that he could at least pay off at this cost. He's not someone I'm particularly excited about, though. This is going to sound wild, but I kind of see Naji Harris as the first good running back handcuff. You kind of need to take him in this range, though, because people recognize that he's also going to have a role. I think early on the season, he's probably the starter over Hampton, and then Hampton takes over very quickly. That's how this often works with veterans and rookies. But I do think at least for the first 4 or 5 weeks, he could be relatively heavily involved and have some good weeks. Over his career, he's only averaged about 4 yards of carries, but he's always gotten a heap of carries. That's not going to happen now. But I do expect that efficiency to pick up because he's now not playing behind the pit line. He's playing behind a very strong Chargers line that knows how to run the ball and is structured around that. I think he probably gets some work in the red zone as well, and that will be effective for him for fantasy. But ultimately, he's not someone you should feel particularly excited about unless there's an injury to Hampton, in which case all of a sudden he becomes a very valuable option. Another guy who's very valuable with an injury, and we're going to see a heap of these guys coming up, is Zack Chark. All he needs is an injury to Kenneth Walker, and we've seen it happen in the past. All of a sudden, he has massive weeks. He finishes the running back 27 last season, and he wasn't the starter. Basically, for the vast majority of the season, he started like 3 games, maybe. He wasn't even particularly efficient. It was a bit more efficient than Walker, but not by much. He got some good receiving work and somehow ended up with 9 touchdowns, but ultimately he is the receiving back in this offense. He still gets a solid amount of supplementary carries, but you're never starting him on a weekly basis until there's an injury. If you're doing a 0 RB strategy, he is someone you must be taking quite early before someone else gets to him, because this is the kind of guy that's going to win you your league in that 0 RB strategy. Now, I have no idea what to do with the Cowboys, but this is another guy you can be taking in that 0 RB situation. There is no point in taking JaVontae Williams if you have 3 good other running backs. It just doesn't make any sense at all. He will not finish any higher than running back 25 or so. The Cowboys aren't going to be good. Williams hasn't been good. He was averaging 3.5 odd yards a carry each of the last 2 seasons. Admittedly, the Broncos line wasn't great and they weren't helping him out a lot. But neither's the Cowboys line. This is going to be an ugly season for Cowboys running backs. And I don't even think that Williams will keep the role for the whole season. Having said that, he does give you a good starting point in that 0 RB strategy. But if you've got 3 running backs already, just pass over him. I don't care where he sits in my rankings. I don't care where he falls to in your draft. You don't take him if you already have at least 3 running backs. Travis Etienne falls into that category similarly, but we do know the upside is there. He was a top 3 running back in 2023. It was that recent. And nothing much has changed. His efficiency was exactly the same. He had the same amount of yards per carry. He just had less touches. He went from 260 odd touches to 150 touches. His amount of receptions dropped, and he became a little bit less efficient through the air. He also had 12 touchdowns in 2023, and he had 2 last season, which is pretty darn ugly. Things don't look good for Etienne. It's hard to tell who's the lead back in Jacksonville. It seems to bounce between Etienne and Bigsby. And if you owned either of them last season, that was very frustrating. Tootin now comes in to make that even uglier as well. I don't like this situation at all, but he is a viable 0 RB option because there is the potential that he's at least solid at times during the season. And I think there's a little bit more upside than most of the guys in this area. If he can somehow clearly win over that number 1 role, and I think it's possible he or potentially Bigsby does that, all of a sudden you have a situation where you at least have a solid running back too. I talked about Rashad White earlier, solid receiving back, but ultimately he's a handcuff. If there's an injury to Bucky Irving, all of a sudden you have an arguably top 10 running back. After all, he was a top 5 running back in 2023 when he had the lead role. And I do not believe that Sean Tucker is going to come in and get enough touches to really disadvantage White. So for that reason, if there's an injury, all of a sudden you want to have Rashad White, so just get him now. Pick him up in those kind of like mid to late rounds. We're talking like round 11 roughly is when I start thinking about White, and he is one of the top handcuff options. Arguably the top true handcuff option though, and if you need a guy who you are not going to need to start at all, then I would go with Isaac Guerendo, because if he gets involved, if Christian McCaffrey goes down, that's a real risk given his injury history. All of a sudden, Guerendo is going to be a league winner. He's going to be a guy that you would have drafted within the first round or early second round, because that role's exactly the same for McCaffrey as it is for whoever steps into it. If McCaffrey goes down, Guerendo becomes the starter. If Guerendo goes down, then all of a sudden you get the rookie Jordan James coming in and being the starter. If he goes down, then Patrick Taylor takes exactly the same role. They just use their running back the same way. They use them on every single down. They do everything with them, and I would expect to see that happen with Guerendo as well. We saw it when he was healthy last season, averaged 5 yards a carry, looked good through the air, averaged 10 yards a reception, was good around the red zone. That is going to happen again if McCaffrey goes down. We know how the 49ers use their backs. This is the guy you want on your bench. I will have him in so many teams. Someone I don't want on my bench at all is Jaden Blue. The reason I put him in here is that when I'm doing rankings, I don't know where your situation is going to be. If you're in a situation where you really need someone who might possibly be useful for you because you're doing a full zero RB strategy, that's where Jaden Blue comes in, because he could be the starter in week 1, or he could certainly be involved in some sort of committee from week 1. So if you're desperate for a running back, then Jaden Blue is the guy that I would be targeting, because I do think there is a real possibility that he has a role. Having said that, if you have at least 3 running backs, like I said with JaVontae Williams, you don't need Jaden Blue because the upside isn't there. He's a 5th-round running back. The odds of him taking over that starting role is low, but it's possible he will, and it's possible if he does it, he will be an every down back. Take what I said about Travis Etienne and just copy and paste it for Tank Bigsby, because we're talking about essentially the same situation here. He looked a little bit better than Etienne last year, but he was used in different situations. He really was not used as a receiving back at all. He has 8 career receptions in 33 games. We are not going to see this guy used through the air. That is going to be Etienne's role regardless, which is why I've got him ranked higher. Having said that, I do think it's slightly more likely that Bigsby ends up as the lead back on early downs. Having said that, I still think Tootin will be involved in that as well. So Bigsby is someone that it's really hard to get excited about. You don't even know he's the early down back. And even if he is the early down back, he's just the early down back. The odds of him being the receiving back is literally 0. J.K. Dobbins actually looked pretty good last year behind that Chargers line, but it's really easy to run with the Chargers. It's a whole lot harder to run with the Broncos. We saw that last year. JaVontae Williams looked awful. No one could get anything going behind this line. I do think they'll have made some improvements. In fact, we know they've made improvements to the line, but I still think the run game remains a major weakness for them. They've tried to throw weapons at it with Harvey and Dobbins. I think Dobbins will arguably be the better runner here. Harvey has a little bit more speed, but he doesn't have the size of Dobbins. Problem is Dobbins isn't exactly great out of the backfield either, so we're going to have to see some sort of weird committee situation where you see McLaughlin or Beatty or Estime get involved. This is going to be pretty ugly for fantasy. I'm not very excited about this situation. It's hard to get excited about Dobbins in general, but there is at least upside there. And I certainly think there's an argument to suggest that he could be the lead back at times during the season, with Harvey kind of taking on a supplementary role. Having said that, teams do tend to be pretty stubborn. And I think for that reason that Harvey will probably keep that lead role, and that Dobbins more of a thunder to his lightning. Ray Davis is another guy that I desperately want on my bench, and he's another guy you can take pretty late. In fact, I'm tempted to move him up because I'm really not sure what's going on with James Cook. The holdout continues. For that reason, Davis has me pretty excited. If Cook were out, for example, all of a sudden Ray Davis is someone that we would be taking running back 13 or 14 range is where we're taking Cook. There's really not that much difference in the talent. There's a little bit, but Davis can do all those things. He's a big guy who can be used in the red zone. Very good on early downs. He's got solid speed. He's a good receiving back. He averaged over 10 yards a reception last season. He was a little bit inefficient with his rushing, but again, they used him a lot on those early downs, and that is a lot harder to pull off. So for that reason, I feel really good about Davis as someone that I want to have as a handcuff option. Just stash him on your bench and just see what happens, because injuries will happen to running backs. Over half the starting running backs this season and every season get injured. That's just how it works. So you're going to see Davis involved with about a 50% probability. That's the kind of thing I want on my bench. At 42, I've got Cam Scatterboo. I don't feel great about this. There is a chance, and it's a low chance, but there is a chance that he can win out the starting role. That doesn't happen a lot with day 3 backs. I think he is in here as more of a early down and short yardage boomer. Because I do think that Tyrron Tracy is the lead back here, and I think that Devin Singletary still remains involved. But I can't discount the possibility that Scatterboo is that guy. I will have him in 0 leagues. I suggest you have him in 0 leagues, certainly 0 non-dynasty leagues at least, because people are taking him, I don't know, 4 rounds earlier than I'm willing to take him. I'm willing to take him around round 13 or so. I would not be touching him earlier than that, and I'm seeing him go as early as round 7 and round 8 in best ball drafts at this stage. I understand that in best ball he has a bit more value because he's going to score quite a few touchdowns, but I'm still not generally in redraft excited about him at all. Now, I can promise that Jalen Warren will finish higher than the running back 43, but I don't feel good about it nevertheless. I think the upside is very much capped, and for that reason, I have no interest in having him in my team outside a 0 RB situation. He's going to go so much earlier than I'm ever going to take him. I don't want him on my team. I think the upside is massively capped because even if you somehow get an injury to Caleb Johnson, Warren doesn't necessarily play every down. All of a sudden, they get Kenneth Gainwell involved more. He's not a true handcuff, and for that reason, I'm not interested. Titus Spears in exactly the same situation as Jalen Warren, as someone that it's hard to get excited about, because even if there's an injury to Tony Pollard, how much do you want the Titans running back? He's maybe a running back too. I think even if Tony Pollard just didn't exist, we'd be taking Spears around, I don't know, 25, 26 anyway, which is where we're taking Pollard. That's the upside with Spears, and that requires a Tony Pollard injury. So there's really very little point in taking Spears unless you're desperate for someone who can maybe get involved. This is very much the opposite of a handcuff situation. This is a 0 RB situation where you need someone who's more likely to be involved and give you something. I would much rather go for someone with upside. Unfortunately, here's another guy who doesn't have that upside in Austin Ekeler. Again, he's going to be involved. He's going to have a role here. I think he'll be a little bit better in PPR, and in PPR, I'd have him another 5 or 6 slots higher than this. But he hasn't been able to stay healthy. He's definitely aging a lot now. We're seeing that in his play now that he's in his 30s. I do think there is the possibility that if he outplays Robinson, he takes over that lead role, and that's why I'm willing to put him at least this high. But I think he's essentially, at this stage, a receiving back and mostly a backup, and they probably use him a fair bit in the return game. Tuden's in here for me because I don't actually know what's going on with the Jaguars, and I don't know that they know either. I feel like this is going to be a camp battle, and one of these guys will win out, or in all probability, none of them wins out and ends up being an awful committee. That's not going to help Tuden regardless, but it is entirely possible, given his talent, that he could be the lead guy, and I'm willing to leave open that possibility, and that's why I'm willing to at least have him on my team. You probably have to take him around the 12th round, 13th round sort of region in a half PPR draft. I think that's about right. That's where you should be taking shots on people. And I think this is at least a shot, but you've got to listen out and see what you're hearing in camp battles before making a decision on this. The biggest concern at the moment is that Liam Cohen's saying that he needs to work on his pass protection. That's pretty normal for a rookie, but it's not exactly what you want because it's going to have you come off the field. That concern alone has me feeling a lot better about Travis Etienne because he's the only guy that basically has a pass catching option for them at the moment. Here's another guy I'll get a lot of late in drafts. Tyler Algier is someone who, if there's an injury ahead of him, will suddenly be a top 10, maybe top 15 running back. Bijan Robinson goes down. We know what Algier can do. He's going to get all of the carries. They have nothing behind him. It's Jace McClellan if you're saying who, rightly so, he's barely ever touched the ball in a game. He's technically their number 3 running back. I do think they probably get someone off free agency if Robinson goes down for the season early in the season, or they trade for someone. But having said that, Algier is still someone I love getting in leagues. We know how good he can be when given opportunities on the ground. Not the greatest receiving back, admittedly, but it's a half PPR league. That's absolutely fine. I do think that he's someone that's going to be valuable. Plus, even if you need him on a bye week, he still gets a surprising amount of touches. He had 140 touches last season. We're talking like nearly 10 a game, especially in games where they're winning early. He does get surprisingly heavily involved, and that could be very valuable for you. At 48, Marshall and Lloyd falls into the exact same situation. He's only actually played one game in his career in the NFL, and he wasn't very good. He had 6 carries for 15 yards and a 3-yard reception. But I do think he is the clear backup running back. They didn't go out and get anyone else. They still have Wilson and Brooks, who are just undrafted free agents. They brought in from last year. They weren't very good either. I do think that Lloyd is the clear number 2 guy here, and there's an injury to Josh Jacobs. You will see a lot of Lloyd. They brought him in to be the backup because A.J. Dillon was so bad. Lloyd is fully healthy and ready to go, according to all camp reports. So for that reason, I am looking forward to seeing what he can do. He will be one of my favorite bench options this season because we know how good the Packers running back can be. Raheem Mostert is ranked number 49 for me. Would I take him in my team if I went 0 RB? This is another guy that is an entirely viable 0 RB option. We know exactly what he can do, even though he is getting a lot older. We have seen some older running backs who are kind of like this kind of like one-cut runner be very effective. He's 33 now. He will be fighting it out with Sincere McCormick for touches behind Ashton Genty. We have heard Pete Carroll come out and call Mostert and Genty thunder and lightning. That's hilarious. Mostert will probably get the first touch of the season and annoy a whole heap of Genty owners, and then by week 3 or so, he's getting 3 touches a game. Having said that, if you desperately need someone for week 1, I do actually think that Mostert probably gets a dozen or so touches. That's just because how these old school coaches tend to roll. At number 50, Rico Dowdle, this is just a handcuff situation. I do think he's the clear handcuff. I don't like Trevor Etienne at all. I think that Dowdle is the guy that's going to take over if we see an injury to Chuba Hubbard, and that has a reasonable amount of value. So that's why I'm bringing him in here. I also think he actually gets a solid amount of touches that you can use in your bye week if you absolutely need to. Now, at this point, we're talking about a whole heap of guys who are essentially mainly backups. So I'm going to roll through them pretty quickly, but it is worth understanding who the best guys to stash on your bench are. At number 51, it is Jordan Mason. He is the backup for Aaron Jones. I also think there is a chance he wins the role, but I think it's a very low chance. He's looked very good for the 49ers, but everyone looks good for the 49ers. I don't think that means very much. I think we'll see he is the clear backup, but if you see a Jones injury, then Mason comes in and he will have a reasonably high amount of value. At number 52, Trey Benson. My concern with Benson is that he's not even the clear backup. I feel like if you get an injury to James Conner, Benson does the early down work, and you get some Demicato and Carter doing some third down work and some 2-minute drills and probably some change of base stuff. Suddenly this becomes a bit more of a committee. That lack of clear every down role hurts Benson quite a bit. Conner makes this role look very good for the Cardinals because of how good he is, and that he's a real world-rounded player. Benson is not that. So his lack of upside is why I'm not too excited about him. Nick Chubb at 53, technically he fulfills this idea of a backup guy. If there's an injury to Joe Mixon, I do think Woody Marks gets pretty heavily involved, but Chubb will be the early down guy, and we know what he can do when he's healthy. If he's somehow healthy this year, and reports suggest he maybe, he certainly says his past injuries are behind him, but I don't believe that. Then we might see that he's at least a little bit effective. But I think we're more talking about a guy who's going to be averaging 4 yards a carry and looking like a shadow of his former self, and probably retires after this season, or just keeps grinding it out to get a paycheck. 54, DJ Giddens is a guy I'm thinking about actually moving up. I need to do a little bit more research into this before I do that, but he's someone that I feel really good about taking as a bench option. He's just got a heap of upside if Jonathan Taylor goes down, because I really don't at all believe in Khalil Herbert. Herbert's technically the number 2. Tyler Goodson's there as well, but Giddens is someone that I think could take over that role. It's just a case of if there's an injury to Taylor, we don't know for now that it's going to be Giddens. It could easily be one of the other guys, which is why I can't have Giddens any higher. At 55, I've got Braylon Allen. I was very high on him last season as a handcuff, but I am concerned a little bit about Allen because Isaiah Davis is still going to be heavily involved if there's an injury to Breece Hall. Having said that, we still saw Allen be an effective option. He was a pretty good receiving back last season. I certainly think that he could be helpful for your fantasy team this season. In a 56, Keaton Mitchell. Look, there's some upside here. If there's a Derrick Henry injury, I think that Mitchell is probably the lead back and Justice Hill kind of gets involved as well. Mitchell looked very good when he was healthy in his rookie season, and then he hasn't been healthy since. He's only played 13 career games, and he hardly got a touch when he came back from injury last season. If he is healthy, and it seems like he is, then I do feel like there's some upside here. Blake Corum comes in at 57, and I don't even know that he's necessarily the backup, but this is such a valuable backup role that I need to have someone in there. Jaquez Hunter is also someone I'm not disinterested in. He's in at 69 for me, but Corum's the guy that's going to be more interesting as an end-of-bench option. Jerome Ford's another end-of-bench option. He will be the starter in Cleveland if we see an injury to Judkins. I think Dylan Sampson would probably come in as the third down back, but Ford would technically be someone who's useful for fantasy. We've seen that happen with him in the past. In 2023, he was the running back 15. Last season, he was the running back 32, and he had all of 3 touchdowns, and he only had 100 carries. But he averaged 5.4 yards a carry, so he is very efficient on his carries. There's something there, but I'm not excited about it. At 59, Jalen Wright, there's some upside as someone who's probably going to take some work off the plate of Devon Achane. And Achane does have a history of occasionally getting injured. And if that happens, all of a sudden Wright becomes that early down option. The issue is Wright is not a receiving back. That would be someone like an Alexander Madison if there's an injury. And there's always the threat of Madison and Gordon taking touches off Wright, even if Achane does go down. So that's why I don't feel very excited about Wright. And finally, in at number 60, I've got Woody Marks. I do think he could technically become the receiving back in Houston, and that could be a relatively valuable role depending on how things go. I think he has a heap of upside as well. I think if Nick Chubb turns out to not look very good and Joe Mixon goes down with injury, all of a sudden Marks could nominally be the starter. I think that's a pretty narrow window to fit through, but I do like Woody Marks, and I wanted to shout him out anyway. And that's been my full redraft running back rankings for now. But you're going to need rankings specific for your league. It's easy to know which running backs to take ahead of others, but it's more important to know when to take them in your specific draft. And that's where I'm here to help. For a very low price, I will set up some rankings specific to your league. Very easy. You walk in and you draft the highest guy on the list. Obviously, I can cater them to your specific situation. You can do with them what you want, but I've been doing this for a couple of years and had a lot of success. People winning their first leagues and people doing very well in their fantasy league. So if you'd like to be involved in that, make sure you email me over at benwasley23@gmail.com. You can obviously just check out my general rankings as well over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. I'll be back soon for my wide receiver rankings.